What's going on, YouTube, and welcome back to Goal Line Hockey. It's your boy Kevin Forte, and today we are going over the Pittsburgh Penguins going into the off season. It looked like a pretty promising year for the Penguins, but again, it only means so much until you get into the playoffs. And unfortunately, in the first round of the Stanley Cup playoffs, they once again cannot get past the first round. A series that looked really good. I mean, they were up 3-1. The Rangers had less than a 10% chance of winning that series, and they came all the way back. A tough blow for the Pittsburgh Penguins. So we're going to go over that series and kind of what we can expect will happen to the Penguins this summer. Some guys that you probably wish weren't leaving the organization that probably will, and my opinions on what they need. What are their team needs this summer? So we'll go over all that right now. So the series, I think that really what you have to take of that series is Crosby was hurt at the end, and that really hurt them. I think when he got hurt in Game 5, that really turned the tide of the series in Game 5. And then also the goaltending, which had they had a Tristan Jarry that was healthy at the beginning of the series, I think he would have been able to take advantage more of the Rangers with Shesterkin struggling early in this series. And I think that really would have been the difference here. And you look at those two factors alone, I think that would have been the difference. They were not good on special teams, which also really hurt them. And I think that's something they may look to address this summer. But that's kind of what you're looking at here going into the offseason is, it lessens the blow slightly. It's not that this team just, like I'd argue Boston wasn't like a good enough team, like in terms of depth and overall play. I don't think that's necessarily the case for the Penguins. I think they've got some good players, but they do rely heavily on Crosby. And, of course, any team in the NHL, especially come playoffs, needs a capable, competent, good goalie. And the Penguins did not have that. So when you look at what this could mean for the offseason, it really comes down to, and I'm actually redoing this video because of the whole Letang and Malkin situation. We've gotten some more information on that. And that's a little bit troubling going into the offseason. So we're going to get to that here. So the Penguins, guys that I think are on their way out of Pittsburgh and played their last game in the black and gold. To start off that list is some of the goaltending. I think they're going to let both Casey DeSmith and Louis Domingue go. I think you're going to ride with Tristan Jarry. I think that's your guy. And you look for a veteran backup. And I think right now, when we get to who could be coming in, I think the return of Marc-Andre Fleury almost sounds like poetic justice at this point. It sounds like Fleury would be a perfect fit there, and I think that's what they'll go with. I think this going with Jarry and Fleury next year, that would be a really good tandem for the Penguins, so I think that's what they're going to do. And the fact that DeSmith has been riddled with injuries, I don't think the Penguins want him to come back. He might get a chance elsewhere. And Louis Domingue, I think that's pretty self-explanatory with how the playoffs went. He's not even a league average goalie come playoff time. And I think that the Penguins need a little bit better from that. And to be honest, another year of development and an off-season of development for Matt Diorio, he might be the better third goalie option anyway. So that's what you're looking at in between the pipes. On defense, I don't think there's going to be a ton of change, but there is a significant guy leaving the organization, in my opinion. So the first one being Nathan Beaulieu. That's not really a big deal. That's a guy they picked up at the deadline from the Jets. Nothing really big there. Kris Letang, though. I think Kris Letang will be leaving the Penguins this summer. We'll get to it later when we talk about him and Gino in particular. But I don't see Letang returning. Up front, I think Brian Boyle will probably retire this summer. I mean, he's getting up there in age. I mean, how much more do you really expect of Boyle to play in this league? He's 37 years old, and I think that he's at that point in his career where if he doesn't resign in Pittsburgh, I think he's just going to say, yeah, this is probably it. So that's what you're looking at there. Alexander Nylander is a restricted free agent. I could see them trading his rights to a team that needs some scoring depth. So don't be surprised if that happens. This was a guy that was supposed to be a pretty good, coveted forward prospect, and Nylander has just not really gotten there. So that's what you're looking at there with Nylander. And then you have some big boys. RICKARD, who got hurt in Game 1 of the playoffs. That was a trade deadline acquisition from the Anaheim Ducks. That hurts. That was a really, again, another big blow to the Penguins center core. He's been playing mostly wing this season, but he could have played center. So that one definitely hurts, losing him in the top 6. That was supposed to be the guy to play with Malkin, right? So that's definitely a tough blow. And then the other two guys in the top 6, Bryan Rust and Evgeni Malkin. I think all of these guys are on their way out. The most likely guy to return of those big 3 forwards, I would say, is probably Bryan Rust. But don't count out RAKELL. But I do think the most likely guy to leave Pittsburgh right now is Evgeni Malkin. And I think, again, I saw him in person in Game 5 at the Garden. And his body language just, I don't know, he didn't seem, there was a lack of urgency and a lack of, he didn't look motivated out there. And I don't know, maybe that's just the way I was seeing it with the lens that maybe he doesn't want to return to Pittsburgh. But I don't know. Let me know what you guys think, because I think Malkin's situation, we might as well just get to this, because this is the big topic of conversation for the Penguins. Is these two guys, for as long as I've been watching hockey, Kris Letang and Evgeni Malkin have been in Pittsburgh. So the idea of them not playing in the Steel City would definitely be something different for me. And this would be a real shakeup to the core of the Pittsburgh Penguins. Not to mention, I'm not giving much credit here to Bryan Rust, but Bryan Rust has been a pretty damn good player in his own right in in Pittsburgh. So those are a couple of guys, if they were to lose, that would be tough on this organization, but I do think that's what they're looking at here. And those are all your UFAs. Now, guys that I think they should keep, more restricted free agents. You're looking at some of the younger guys. I think DANTON HEINEN is a really good player. I think they need to re-up him. He's a guy that you probably don't throw in the top 6 as a center. He's definitely more of a 3rd, 4th line center. But he's still a pretty good player, and I think that he's got that, that kind of gritty, scrappy DNA in his game from his time in Boston. I think he's a really good fit with the Penguins right now. Evan Rodrigues, I think, depending on what happens this summer, I think they're going to need a center behind Crosby. Ideally, Evan Rodrigues is a 3rd-line center, but I think with what he's shown this season, he can be a top 6 center for a short period of time. If there's an injury to a 2nd-line center, you could throw Evan Rodrigues there and be kind of comfortable. Rodrigues has been incredible this season. He's had a breakout season in the National Hockey League, a guy that was kind of a fill-in player in the Connor Sheary trade when he was traded to the Buffalo Sabres at the deadline. He ended up going to the Washington Capitals, where he is today. But that was a kind of a throw-in piece, Evan Rodrigues. And you look at where this team is with Rodrigues, they did quite well this offseason with him. He did have that tough game, Game 6? He took that bad penalty. That was a theme in this series, bad penalties being taken, especially when Crosby went down with that injury. Again, in Game 5, we saw Malkin take some stupid penalties in that 3rd period. Rodrigues take a tough penalty. DANTON HEINEN taking a tough penalty in Game 7 in overtime. So that was a theme for the entire team, and you can't really call out Evan Rodrigues just for that. On the blue line, I like Pierre-Olivier-Joseph. That's the guy they picked up from the Phil Kessel trade in Arizona. Pierre-Olivier-Joseph is a really solid prospect. He's maybe not the top pairing defenseman that they were hoping he would be, but I think he's still a pretty good NHL player, and I think that the Penguins are desperately going to need to rebuild that blue line, especially if Letang goes. That's a really good piece to build around alongside maybe a guy like Marcus Pettersson and John Marino. I think those are your 3 defensemen that you're looking at. You do have that Matheson contract. You do have the remnants of that Brian Dumoulin contract, which is up in 2023. So, you still have that, but I think Pierre-Olivier-Joseph gets them in the right direction. I think he's a top 6 defenseman in the National Hockey League, at the very least in the depth chart right now of the Pittsburgh Penguins. Again, especially if you're losing a guy like Letang. And then Alex Diorio, we talked about him a little bit earlier when I talked about some of the goalies coming in and out. I think he'd be a good 3rd goalie behind Fleury and Jarry. Again, this is the assumption that Fleury's going there, but I'm just putting him as a placeholder. Whatever veteran goaltender goes behind Jarry that can play, I think that's what you're looking at. And I think Diorio is a really good third goalie. He can play in Wilkes-Barre Scranton, in Wilkes-Barre Scranton. I think that's a really good fit for him right now. Let him develop a little bit more. He is still young. I think he's 23, 24. So he's still fairly young, and I think that maybe he's not going to be the superstar goaltender, right? They've got other goalies from Europe kind of in that spot, and they may overtake him as the third goalie by training camp. But I think that it would be a wise move to keep Diorio around. Not to mention he has a great name. So some guys that I think, this is more of a necessity than something they actually want to do, but I think they have to make some trades. Kasperi Kapanen, I know they talked about it at the trade deadline. I think they will get something done here. He is a restricted free agent this summer, so expect them to get, at the very least, a second-round pick, maybe even 2 second-round picks for Kasperi Kapanen. I think that's asking for a lot, but if they can at least get a second-round pick, it gets them in the right direction. Maybe they're able to recoup one of those second-round picks in this year's draft. They also don't have their third-round pick in this year's draft, so they traded some of their draft capital, which they said they didn't want to do. They were very insistent on not trading that first-round pick, which they do have for the next 3 seasons. And Marcus Pettersson. I think the reason that they would like to move these guys is depending on what happens here with Malkin and Rust and Letang and some of those other guys, they're going to need to create cap space. But if they lose those guys, you're already gaining the cap space. So maybe you aren't as hesitant or as incentivized to trade Kapanen and a guy like Marcus Pettersson on the blue line just to create cap space. You're going to lose that anyway by some of those guys not returning. So I think that's what we could see the Penguins do. Again, it depends on what happens with the other guys, but I do think secondary guys that if they were to lose some of those core guys, I could see Kapanen and Pettersson returning next season. More likely Pettersson, but I do see Kapanen still very much on the trade block. Guys that I could see coming into the Penguins lineup next season. Again, if you're going to lose all this talent up front and on the back end, who are some guys that can come in? We already talked about on the blue line, guys like Pierre-Olivier-Joseph. I think he's a really good player, and I think that they want to get a little bit more out of him and see what he really is at the National Hockey League level. Let me know what you guys think of Pierre-Olivier-Joseph. I know he's not as hyped as he was, but I do think he's still a pretty good player and could make the NHL. Some forwards, Philip Hallander, who they got in the Jared McCann trade, which Toronto absolutely lost because he ended up going in the expansion draft anyway to Seattle. That's part of the reason Pittsburgh traded him in the first place. So they have Philip Hallander and Samuel Poulin. I think those two guys are definitely hot prospects for Pittsburgh. I know Poulin's definitely lost a little steam this year, especially with how he played in the American Hockey League in Wilkes-Barre, but I think those are two guys up front that I think that the Penguins will like to explore. I don't see them trading them, especially when this team's getting younger and losing the talent they could be losing, but I think those are guys that could make the NHL lineup in the fall. And again, when you're looking for cheaper contracts, entry-level contracts in the bottom 6, that's where those guys come in. Expect to see a little bit more of a guy like Drew O'Connor, too, who we saw toward the end of the season. And I'd like to say that Teddy Bluger is still a young guy on the team, but he's 28 years old, 27, 28 years old. So you can't necessarily say that. Same thing for Evan Rodrigues. They just kind of got a later start in their development at the National Hockey League level. So expect to see a little bit more from those guys next year. Again, as this team kind of starts to turn a new leaf and kind of change overall, because this is not the same Penguins team that we saw. They are definitely a little bit different here, and I think that it's not a bad thing, but again, there's going to be some changes, and it makes you wonder, again, when you've got, I think ideally, and this is kind of the end of the conversation here, with Malkin and Letang. So apparently, again, this is a rumor that's been floating around, so take with it what you will, but I've heard it from a couple different sources. Really what they're saying is don't expect Malkin and Crosby to be back, and that's really the focal point of today's video. So apparently this is from Rob Rossi. The Penguins offered Evgeni Malkin and Kris Letang 3-year deals at a $5 million AAV, which is an annual average value per season, and it did not sit well with Sidney Crosby. He thought that was a low ball by Ron Hextall and Brian Burke. So I think that's something to consider here. I mean, maybe a little bit of a, kind of what Jonathan Toews has been kind of saying in Chicago. He's been upset with the direction of the franchise. Maybe is Crosby saying the same thing. I don't like the direction of this franchise right now. And to be fair, I hate to say it, yes, of course this is a loss to the locker room. Of course this is a loss of talent. I mean, the amount of points those two put up, even this season alone, I mean, it's over 100 points, right? I mean, to give them $5 million contracts, yeah, but you know what? That's the game. And when you consider right now, Malkin right now is 35 years old. And the rumor was it was a 3-year deal, right? So that would have taken him till 38, which is the summer of 2025, which is also, interestingly enough, the same summer that Crosby's contract ends. So to say that, this is a bad move, I mean, I don't think that's necessary. I mean, what do you want to give them? Like $8 or $9 million per year because they think that's what they're worth? I don't know really what that's all about. I mean, maybe would it be more respectable if it was $7 million, right? $7 million for each of them. You get $14 million per season for the talent that they've given you. I think there's something to be said about that. But we know Brian Burke follows the philosophy a lot. A lot of general managers, along with Hextall, follow the mentality that, you have to weigh what you're going to get in the beginning of the contract to the end of the contract. So let's say in the first year and a half, is it going to be worth the production of $7 million per year that they might not have in the last year and a half of their contract? Again, they're going to be 37, 38 years old at that point. So you are asking for a lot. And again, both of them, Letang and Malkin, are 35 years old. So if you're going to give them each 3-year contracts, you're not going to give them the sun and the moon either. And again, it makes sense why they would do that because this is the cup window, right? The next 3 years. Because now, if you don't keep Malkin and Letang, well, what do you do with what you could argue is one of the best players in the National Hockey League in Sidney Crosby? Because if you don't keep Malkin and Letang, what's left behind Crosby? I mean, of course, yes, I'm giving credit here to Jake Guentzel, but because that is going to be the next face of this team after Crosby, but I don't know, there's not much there, and that's maybe where the Penguins go into free agency, and maybe we see Hextall and Burke maybe make some questionable moves. They bring in guys that maybe don't gel with what they're trying to do because, again, Malkin and Letang have been there for so long. Would they be able to replace those players with somebody that's maybe for $7 million going to give you more production? Again, those are the kind of things you have to consider here. So apparently, again, that's the low ball from Andrew Filipino. The Penguins were hoping for a 3-year term for Evgeni Malkin, but couldn't agree on money, and that's from Elliot Friedman. So again, you're seeing the same sentiment. Everybody that called me crazy during the season that they're not going to trade them, they're going to come back, it might be more likely now than not that they don't return. The Pittsburgh Penguins are not close to re-signing defenseman Kris Letang. Again, that's from Elliot Friedman last week. So you're just seeing the same sentiment here that the Penguins probably won't keep those guys. Now, here's the positive thing, Penguins fans. There is some positivity here. So this is also from Elliot Friedman. There could be a chance that Marc-Andre Fleury returns to the Penguins this summer. I think there's reason to believe that makes sense. To see him return to Minnesota, I think that's a little bit of a stretch. I think they like Cam Talbot as a starter. And Fleury was supposed to be, the rental guy that comes in to help them push for a cup. And obviously that was a failed effort. So I don't see Fleury coming back to Minnesota. But I do think he could return to Pittsburgh. And I think that's one of very few options that I think if he were to return to the NHL, like he's saying he wants to, I do think there may be a little bit already the sentiment that he is coming back to Pittsburgh. I wonder if they already talked about that because Fleury's very confident that he's coming back to the league next year, and I think there are very few teams he would go to, and the fact he's already saying he's coming back already leads me to believe he already has something kind of in his back pocket that he knows he's going somewhere already. So, again, I think that's what you're looking at here. overall for the Penguins, it's one of those things. You know, you've got a really good Warrior goalie. I mean, shout out to Tristan Jarry, the way he finished out Game 7 with a broken foot. I mean, he had a cast on after the game, couldn't walk. You could tell during the game he was staying on one leg a lot, trying to, you know, stay on that knee just to alleviate some of the pressure on his foot. You could tell he was hurting, and he played very well in that Game 7, considering the circumstance and the fact he was not healthy. Not healthy one bit. So, shout out there to him. Same thing for Crosby, a Warrior. He had a concussion and kind of fighting through that. There's probably a little bit of debate on whether he should have done that or not, or the league should have let him do that or not. Guess that's up for discussion as well. But guys, it's going to be an interesting summer in Pittsburgh to wrap this up. But again, this is kind of how it works. And I think there is a little bit of a divide all of a sudden here in Pittsburgh. Maybe a little bit of a disrespect sentiment towards some of the older guys, and that might be the demise of the core of this dynasty of a Pittsburgh Penguins team. Definitely the best Penguins team that they've ever iced. I mean, you look at this legacy here with Malkin and Crosby. I mean, this is the most successful Penguins team, really Penguins core, that we've ever seen, and I think a lot of that credit has to go to those two guys, and including Letang as well. And again, a guy that we're not talking much about, but I think does play a significant part on this roster is Bryan Rust. He may be leaving the organization as well. Guys, that is it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.